Hello, Jessica. Thank you so much for being in our interview today.
Of course.
Right. So can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, hello everyone. My name is Jessica. I'm currently a second-year medical student at UofT, and I did my undergrad at UofT as well at the Mississauga campus, specializing in neuroscience. And yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I know you said you did your undergrad at UofT, which is like notoriously hard for, maintaining a high GPA while also being able to do a lot of MCAT. So can you share us a little bit about your application stats, like your GPA and MCAT?
Yeah, for sure. So my GPA was a 3.96 after it being converted, and my MCAT was a 518. And I definitely agree with you, La. It's very hard to maintain a GPA, a good GPA at UofT. So I think one of the best strategies that I used was to not take any unnecessary courses, any unnecessary harder courses. So for example, I did not take first year physics because I didn't need it. I didn't take the second part of organic chemistry because I did not need it. So I would say a great technique is to make sure you know the classes that you're taking and you have a good idea of what the prerequisites are for each med school that you're applying to, and then catering your course schedule around that, and then also taking a mixture of lighter courses and harder courses just so that you're not overburdened with your course load. And I guess in terms of maintaining this high GPA, I think it comes down to individual study strategies. So in first year, even before starting UofT or starting your undergraduate program, really try to figure out what your study strategy is and what works best for you. How are you able to retain all the information that's being thrown at you? For me, I am the type of person to do everything a little bit last minute because I need that pressure to get me started. And I do not recommend that for almost everyone. It just works for me, but some people have other study strategies that work best for them. Like I know a lot of people use Anki, a lot of people use sort of segmented study strategies. And so I would say the best part is to figure out what works for you and then stick to that. And also change it up if it doesn't work for every single course, because that's what you're going to find. Let's say your biology courses are going to be a little bit different than let's say your more psychology and more literature related courses.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. I really resonated in the fact that you said everyone's learning style is very different. For me personally, I never got Anki. It never worked for me. I just find it very rigid, and I can't really study from that. So I would say, there's tons of study methods that you can, learn from your peers and learn from upper years and try them out, see if you like them or not. And then over time, once you get used to the intensity of undergraduate, you kind of develop your own framework of studying method and stick to it. I think that's the best way of studying. Thank you for sharing that. You also mentioned something in the sense that you said your OMSAS GPA is 3.97? 3.96. Is that different from your UofT GPA, or is there a special conversion that we have to be aware of when you're converting?
Yeah, so there are a couple of Excel sheets floating around online on Reddit. I highly recommend downloading one of those. Every single school has a different conversion chart. And so I don't remember what my raw GPA was, but you have to understand that I did my undergrad during COVID times, during lockdown. And so I think they gave us a little bit of a leeway in one of the semesters, so I also took that into account. And so there are several things that were taken into account when I calculated my GPA. So just keep that in mind. It's not your UofT GPA that counts, it's the OMSAS GPA that counts.
Okay, that's good to note because people may get confused in terms of thinking about what their GPA is if there's a difference. Because I know that for Western, it's pretty straightforward. You can find a calculator online that can help you. But good to know that people should be extra aware of that.
I will also add that at UofT, a 4.0 is at 85%, but on the OMSAS scale, a 90% is a 4.0, and an 85 is a 3.9. So just keeping those things in mind is very helpful when it comes to studying for your exams and creating sort of targets and goals.
That's good because you would actually your GPA may actually be lower and on OMSAS compared to UofT if you were only using the UofT criteria for your GPA. So good to know. But Western, just for your own interest, it matches. So the OMSAS 90% is Western's 90%. So it's easier for Western students in that sense. Awesome. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. I want to talk a little bit about your other parts of your application, not just your like basic stats. As we all know, UofT focuses not only on the GPA, not only on the MCAT. You need to have some extracurricular development. So can you tell us a little bit about your ECs if you're willing to share, and then some of your tips on how to find, how to navigate first year, especially entering university, finding the right ECs and how to maintaining them or like develop them throughout the years.
Yeah. So you're completely correct in saying that UofT looks at holistic applicants. So they really look at how you are as a person, not just your stats, not just your MCAT or your GPA. And a biggest part of my journey was having a large range of volunteering activities and having long-term volunteering activities, which I think shows a lot of growth and perseverance in that activity. And so, for example, I volunteered with children with disabilities. I did a bunch of like online sessions with them. I did cooking classes with them. And then at the same time, I was volunteering at the hospital. And so this was sort of my community-oriented volunteering experiences. And UofT is a great school in that you can find a lot of volunteer opportunities at UofT itself. So I would say look into volunteering with the accessibility services, with the academic services as well. So becoming and this is very UofT specific. So like looking into becoming a volunteer note taker, a facilitated study group leader, or even volunteering with your health and counseling services. They have a bunch of really cool roles that you can look into, which cover a lot of aspects that UofT Med School is looking for. So they're looking for health promotion, leadership, collaboration, and you can find a lot of these roles in a lot of the volunteer opportunities that UofT itself provides. So I would say keep an eye on that. And then at the same time, looking into your own community, whether that be in Toronto, Mississauga, Scarborough, and seeing how you can help out your community in other ways. Like, as I mentioned, I did volunteering at a hospital, but it doesn't have to be at a hospital. It could be like at your local food bank. It could be at your local shelter. So anything that shows that you are committed to your community and that you have experience interacting with your community as well. And I guess like the social determinants of health, and you have experience interacting and being involved with how these determinants affect every single person's life, especially in your community.
Awesome. So a lot of people may be wondering, I think, especially pre-meds, that do you need volunteer hospitals or do you need those clinical exposures to be able to be competitive for med school admissions? I know you said you volunteer at the hospitals, but can you share a little bit about your insights on that?
Yeah, for sure. So that's a really good question. And I might not even have like the exact answer, but I can speak from my experience. So I did volunteer at the hospital. And for me, that was a very enriching experience because I did it during the pandemic. So I was a volunteer screener. So I saw how the pandemic and like the lockdown really impacted hospital services. So that was sort of my unique connection to volunteering. And I volunteered in Brampton, which was particularly hit by the pandemic. So in that sense, I had a bit of a unique experience. But when it comes to clinical volunteering in general, I don't think it's necessary for your application. I have a bunch of other classmates in my class at UofT, at other med schools, who have not volunteered at the hospital at all, and they haven't had any clinical exposure. However, they have volunteered in their community. And I think UofT and other med schools take put a lot of emphasis on that, being able to have these experiences with people in your community, and then being able to talk about those experiences and how maybe you were in some sort of situation and how you went about that situation. So like your problem solving skills, your decision making skills, your leadership skills, and just being able to find these opportunities, not just in the hospital, but in other areas in life, will be very helpful when it comes to writing up your applications and practicing for your interviews as well.
Got it. Thank you. Maybe one more question about maybe the EC development is like a lot of people, I know I had this concern when I was in pre-med. It's like, how do I make myself stand out? How do I do, things that other people haven't done before? Or if I do just this volunteering with children, or if I just volunteer at the hospital, is that significant or unique enough for me to stand out in my application? What are your thoughts on that?
Very good question. I think the biggest thing is being authentic to yourself. So I wouldn't think too hard about it. I would say just go with the flow. Go with what you're interested in. And what you have personal experience with as well. So for example, I liked working with kids. I had been working with kids since high school. And so that's sort of how I chose which volunteering area I wanted to go into. But at the same time, I chose to volunteer with students and children with disabilities. And the main reason for that was because I do have family members who suffer similar difficulties and suffer with the similar disabilities. So I had a bit of a personal connection there as well. And so that was sort of the route that I took. However, if you're interested in things like, let's say you're interested in sports, you could volunteer somewhere in sports. If you're interested in baking, cooking, I'm sure there's so many volunteer areas in that field as well, like volunteering at your local food bank, cooking meals for homeless people, or like cooking meals for the underserved in general. So I would say stick to yourself, be authentic. I know that's very cliche, but I truly think when you're writing your applications, it really shows that this is who you are and this is where your interests lie. And that's sort of where the long-term commitment comes as well. If you are volunteering at many various different places for short periods of time, I personally think that's a bit of a red flag, considering you haven't shown that you are committed to a certain area. And this area, it doesn't have to shape the potential specialty that you want to go into. Like, for example, as I mentioned, I volunteered with kids, but I'm not really interested in pediatrics. So don't use that as a framework either. Just do what you like doing and don't be basic.
Yeah. I was just gonna say the same thing. Like, the important thing about your ECs is not about how unique they are, it's really what you took away from them, because that's really the key thing about your ECs. Firstly, the lessons you learn from them often stem from chronicity, so long-term involvement will help you to gain more from that experience versus just a short-term experience in general, right? So having good hours, long-term, a couple years, is usually a good reflection of the quality of the EC. Secondly is like your interests, right? So a lot of times we feel more passionate about things that are meaningful to us, and that way we can write more meaningful, takeaways and lessons that are reflected in our maybe essays, which are really important for UofT mission. So I think really don't think about the generic, how generic the ECs are. Really focus on what can you learn from that EC that are meaningful for you personally, personal growth. Can you talk about it in your essays or your interviews as a takeaway, or even your Casper? And then finally, do we have good hours, and do we have a good number of entries in our application? That's the key thing. Okay, awesome. So let's shift gear a little bit. I want to touch a little bit on the research. As we all know, UofT is a huge university for research, and a lot of people think that you need research to be able to be competitive for UofT. What are your thoughts on that?
I will say that is just a stereotype. You do not need 20 publications to apply to UofT Med School. I think, and I personally did not have any publications. I think what they're looking at is an interest in research. So showing that you've done research projects, that you've worked with supervisors, that you've worked with a research group or a research team, and that there was some tangible output. So for example, I had a couple of poster presentations. I did my undergraduate thesis. I did independent research projects, so IRPs, which are, I believe, specific to UofT as well. And I did an ROP as well, which is also specific to UofT. So showing that you've done these research projects and that you've gained skills from them, that you've gained, and it doesn't have to be like publication or publishing skills. It can just be things like doing an oral presentation, doing a poster presentation, showing that you were really there and you helped out in data collection and data processing and data cleaning. Because realistically, those are the type of responsibilities that you get as an undergraduate student in most research labs. So I don't think U of T is expecting you to be like a top researcher by the time you're finished undergrad. That's very unrealistic. And so I believe they're just looking for you. They're just looking that you've done research projects, that you've had some sort of output, some sort of presentation, and that you've had a long-term relationship with the research groups that you've been at. So I think that's also a big thing. So going back to the chronicity, showing that you've worked in this research area for like 1 year, 1.5 years, 2 years almost, shows a lot of commitment. And another part of that is like showing development over time. So you might have started off as a volunteer student in the lab. You went and became like an IRP or an ROP student. You might have gone like an NCERC in the lab, and then you're doing a thesis in the same lab. And I think that progression is very valuable. And that was sort of my progression as well.
Yeah, that's great. I share the same sentiments as you. Actually, a couple of our classmates actually got into medical school without any prior experience, like any at all. So it shows you that, if you don't have any valuable or like significant research experience, don't feel like UofT is gonna discriminate against you, because it doesn't, right? It's more so about the meaning you took away from it, the development, and then you as a whole person. Awesome. So I want to move on to a little bit about the application season. As you know, OMSAT's deadline has passed, and people are now waiting anxiously for their interviews. So maybe for future applicants, what are your tips on essays? How to write the good essays, and how did you prepare for your interviews?
Yeah, so I believe the interview process and the essay process does not start when you start writing the essay, because a lot of what you write in your essay is going to come from the experiences that you've had throughout your life. So I would say right from the beginning, right from, I believe it's 16, when you can start writing down your experiences in your ABS, I think you should start noting down, keep a diary, keep like a notes app or a file of experiences, unique experiences that you've had with unique people and situations that you've been in where you've had to problem solve or decision make or become a leader or a collaborator, all of these can-med roles, and really create a repository of all of these experiences. Not even like you don't have to do it during. I know this is like a lot of pressure, especially if you haven't done it from the beginning, but even just taking the time and sitting down and reflecting on what you've experienced so far in all of your volunteer, extracurricular activities, research activities will be very, very beneficial when it comes to writing your essays and preparing for your interview, because the bulk of these essays, interviews comes from these experiences. You will be referencing these experiences, and you have to make sure that they are very specific as well. So make sure that you're naming names, not the real names, create a fake name, but you're naming specific people, and you're talking about a specific problem, and you're talking about a specific solution that you had to this problem. So that's a very general framework of how you should be organizing your essay and your interview as well. And I feel like if you have these experiences in your back pocket, it becomes very easy in your interview. So they will ask you a question, and you can go through your logic and then bring up these experiences that you've thought about as real life examples that you've gone through, and that you've and that's how you can relate the question back to you as a person and your individual experiences. And I think that's key to being a good responder and a good applicant.
Got it. And that's a great way of approaching the essays. So any suggestions to the style of writing? Like how should I write my essays? Some people like, do I write an essay? Do I write like a narrative? Like how do I make my story more impressive and engaging to the reader?
Yeah, for sure. So I know in the US, they love their narratives. They love storytelling. And I would say here at U of T specifically, they also really like storytelling as well. But it shouldn't make up the bulk of your essay. I think it's good to have your stories in there, but you should also do your own reflection within the question and make sure that you're answering the question as well. I know from past experience and from reading different essays how some people just go into their experience and they forget to talk about how that experience relates back to the question. So definitely start off with a bit of a thesis, go into your story. It doesn't have to be one story, it could be multiple interactions. Make sure you reference your interactions back to your ABS section and your verifier. They really like that. U of T really likes that in me. And then at the end, tie it back to what the question was, whether it was a quote. Tie it back to how your experience related to the quote, or if it was just a question, talk about how what you learned in the experience related back to that question. So I think that's a good way to really organize and structure your essay and even your interview as well.
Got it. Yeah, I agree. A good way to think about it is think about the chronicity, like write about in a chronological order sometimes help. So that way you can talk about the story progression as well as like the things you learn probably progresses more deeply the more you go through that experience. So that's one way you can talk about it. And then building a narrative, in my opinion, is a very important thing to get a good U of T essay, because if you write it like an essay, it tends to get a little bit boring. And one thing that I feel like a lot of students, when I'm reading their essay, that is lacking a little bit is emotions. I think emotion is a huge underrated part of a good essay, in the sense that a lot of students describe in their experience what they have done, what they learn, but they miss kind of the emotional aspect, which is also something that brings the power out of the essay, because we resonate with emotion. If you're able to describe your struggles, how you felt in that moment, your happiness when you help someone, or you feeling accomplished when you achieve like a long-term goal, that really resonate with someone, making the essay more genuine and more personal. So thank you. One last thing I want to talk to you about is in terms of maybe the students who have already entered the first year or like are applying for university in this year. Do you have any tips for them maybe before getting into university, or like what during their first year of university?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say, again, find yourself. Find what study practices work best for you. Really think and reflect on whether medicine is your path, or if you're interested in other fields. I have so many friends who started off in first year wanting to go into medicine, but they ended up switching up in between and they decide to go into research or other areas. So if you've dedicated or if you've committed to medicine as your field, I would say think about it, reflect, talk to people in the field, make sure that you're sure, and then structure all of your activities, your academic goals, your extracurriculars, the connections you make around medicine, just so that you have a better chance at getting in. And I know that sounds very sociopathic a little bit, structuring your life out like this, but the reality is, especially here in Ontario, the success rate isn't that high. So you really have to start planning early on, and don't take me the wrong way. There are a lot of students who decide like in third and fourth year that medicine is their field and they want to go into medicine. And like some of them do end up getting in. But I would say to be safe, try figuring that out in the beginning. And then if you change your mind along the way, that's okay. But at least you didn't have to start prepping for medicine in your third and fourth year without having those connections with professors, without having those research opportunities, because it's a lot harder out of undergrad to get these opportunities unless you go on and do your master's.
Absolutely. And there's no harm in starting early, right?
Yeah.
Like you're getting a good GPA, finding research opportunity, getting volunteer experience are all really good growth in you as a person, even if you don't go into medicine. So starting early, there's no harm in that. And thank you so much, Jessica, for the interview. I'm sure this will help a lot of people who are, pre-med or applying to university or in the application cycles. And we appreciate you being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Nice.